Okay everyone, hello. Let's go ahead and take a look at solving quadratic equations. Now before we go ahead and start off with solving quadratic equations, let's just go ahead and take a look at how we solved a linear equation. So here's a linear equation, 2x minus 5 is equal to 0. In order to solve for x, we added 5 to both sides of the equation to come up with 2x is equal to 5. Then we divided both sides by 2 to come up with x is equal to 5 halves. Now, in order for us to check whether or not that's the solution to this linear equation, I take x is equal to 5 halves and I resubstitute it back into the original equation. So I come out with 2 times the quantity 2 minus 5. Is that equal to 0? Now, if it's the solution, of course, it will be true. And sure enough, if we go ahead and perform these operations on the left side of the equation, we come up with 5 minus 5, which of course is equal to 0. 0 is equal to 0. Then we know that x is equal to 5 over 2 is the solution to this linear equation. Now we're going to move further on and we're going to take a look at a different type of equation, of course, which is quadratic. So if we wanted to go ahead and solve a quadratic equation and say, for example, x squared is equal to 5x plus 14, how do we go about doing that? Well, we're going to have to approach it differently than our linear equations because we can't necessarily solve for x. So what do we need to do? We need to use a different property called the zero product property, and this property will help us solve a quadratic equation. Now, the zero product property states this. It says if you have two quantities, a and b, and if you multiply them together and it comes out to 0, then that means that a is equal to 0 or b is equal to 0. Now let's think about that. Now if a times b is equal to 0, then that means that either a or b or both have to be 0. And we can also go ahead and read it in the other way as well. If a or b is equal to 0 or both are equal to 0, then sure enough the product will be equal to 0 as well. Now, how do we go about using the zero product property to help us solve quadratic equations? Well, there's a couple of things that we want to go ahead and take a look at first with regards to how to methodically solve for quadratic equations. And here's just a couple of pointers that I found useful for students in order to make sure that they can use the zero product property to solve these quadratic equations. Now, the first thing, if we want to go ahead and use the zero product property, you need to make sure that the quadratic is equal to 0. So notice when we talked about the zero product property, we needed to make sure that whatever we had was equal to 0. So we need to set our quadratic equal to 0. Second thing, this is not necessary, this is not absolutely necessary, but it makes it more convenient to solve for the quadratic if we make the coefficient of the quadratic term positive. In other words, we make a greater than 0. Okay, the next step after that is once we have a quadratic that looks like this, that is set equal to 0, where a is greater than 0, then we can factor. Okay, now if we go ahead and factor the quadratic, notice that again, this is a quadratic equation, so we have equals 0 as well. And then what we're going to do is we're going to apply the zero product property, because this form right here is exactly this form here. Algebraically, they're equivalent statements. We got two quantities equal to 0, two quantities that are multiplied together, which is equal to 0, and sure enough, these are the two factors that are multiplied together to be equal to 0. That means that we can apply the zero product property. If we know that this is true, then we can set each one of the factors to be equal to 0, and then we can solve for the factors by solving for the variables. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at this particular quadratic equation that we started off with. What we need to do first, of course, is we need to go ahead and make sure that we set it equal to 0. So what we'll do is we'll subtract 5x and subtract 5x and subtract 14 from both sides of the equation to come up with x squared minus 5x minus 14 is equal to 0. So notice that we have a complete. Now notice that the coefficient of our quadratic is the coefficient of the quadratic term is 1, which is positive, and so we're okay with that. Then what we need to do is we need to go ahead and factor the quadratic. So if we factor the quadratic, we come up with x minus 7 and x plus 2. and of course that's equal to 0. Now remember, before you go ahead and go any further with this, one thing that you really want to do is just double check that your factorization is correct, distribute, and make sure that you're coming out with the exact same quadratic that you started off with. And sure enough, if we use FOIL, that's x squared minus 7x and plus 2x, that's minus 5x, and that's negative 7 times by positive 2 and negative 14. So you know your factorization is correct. So move on. Now once we have that, we're going to apply the zero product property. Again, it says that if you have two quantities that are multiplied together and it's equal to 0, two quantities that are multiplied together equal to 0, then A is equal to 0, one quantity is equal to 0, or the other quantity is equal to 0, or both are true at the same time. So what I write here is, notice that the x minus 7, which is the first quantity, is going to be equal to 0, or the second quantity is going to be equal to 0 as well. Now, once we get to this step, I'm hoping that everybody recognizes, well, this is just a simple linear equation. And once you get a simple linear equation, you just solve for the variable, and voila, we get x is equal to 7, or x is equal to negative 2. Now, again, we want to just be sure that those are in fact the solutions that we have. So if we go ahead and substitute that back into our original equation, sure enough, take a look, we got 7 quantities squared is equal to 5 times it by 7 plus 14. Are those two quantities going to be equal to each other? And sure enough, we come up with 49 is equal to 35 plus 4, which is of course, which is not 49. Oh, sorry. That's 14 and not 4. Which is sure enough going to give us 49. Now, on the other side over here, we have x is equal to negative 2. If we do the substitution, we got negative 2 quantity squared. Is that equal to 5 times negative 2 plus 14? And sure enough, we got 4 is equal to negative 10 plus 14. And sure enough, that is equal. So we know that these two values, x is equal to 7 or x is equal to negative 2, is a solution of the quadratic equation that we were originally given. Now let's just go ahead and take a look at one more example. Take a look at this. Now notice this one over here looks like it's factored, but we cannot apply the zero product property until we actually have this factored form equal to 0. So we need to go ahead and get this form first. So notice what we did is we distributed the x to x minus 4 to come up with x squared minus 4x is equal to 77. Of course, we have to set that equal to 0, so we subtract 77 from both sides to come out with this quadratic here. Now notice again, the coefficient of our quadratic term is positive, so we can move to the next part, which is just factoring. So factor, we get x minus 11, x plus 7 is equal to 0. Again, double check that your factorization is correct. So that's x squared, that's minus 11x, plus 7x, that's minus 4x, and then minus 77 equals 0. I know I'm correct. Now what I can do then is apply the zero product property. I have two quantities that are multiplied together equaling 0. Therefore the x minus 11, or the first quantity, is equal to 0, or the second quantity, which is x plus 7, is equal to 0. Now we can solve for the linear equations. So I get x is equal to 11 or x is equal to negative 7. Again, go through the check process by substituting into the original equation, and we come out with 11 times it by the quantity 11 minus 4. Is that equal to 77? And sure enough, we come out with 11 times by 7 equaling 77, and sure enough, that is correct. And if we go ahead and substitute negative 7 again into our original equation, we come up with negative 7 times the quantity, negative 7 minus 4. Is that equal to 77? And sure enough, it is, because 77 is the same thing as negative 7 times negative 11. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap up again. Solving quadratic equations is slightly different from solving linear equations. We need to make sure that we use the zero product property. And in order to use the zero product property, if we follow these 5 steps, you should be able to go ahead and factor any quadratic that is factorable. Okay, so we'll go ahead and take a look at some of the examples the next time that we meet in class, and we'll also go ahead and take a look at any questions that you have during that time as well. So good luck with this. See you next time. Bye-bye.